Hi, we're now at session 10 of this block 1 and talking about cultural property protection and the international and national humanitarian sector. If we go back to the 1954 drafting of the Hague Convention, and in fact this quote that you've seen before from 1955 from the International Committee of the Red Cross, commenting on the Hague Convention and its process, and I read, "In the future, the Red Cross should no longer be alone in its campaign against indiscriminate methods of warfare. In any case, it should be able to count among its most faithful allies all those who work to establish the Convention for the Protection of Cultural Property, and all those who consider it to be a valuable acquisition. May all the efforts pursued, both under the Red Cross and under the Blue and White Shield, be mutually upheld in order that the aim in view may be more easily attained." So there we are. We've got some complete synergy between those people involved in drafting the 54 Convention and, as they called it then, the Blue and White Shield, as to what we were trying to do. However, those early aspirations seem to have been lost. Despite organising a meeting of experts on cultural property protection in the event of armed conflict in 2002, in 2003, when I first got involved in CPP, the Red Cross was not interested in working to protect cultural property in Iraq, as they argued that they had to be seen to be focusing on people and not old things affected by the conflict. So no Red Cross involvement in 2003 in CPP. And CPP does not currently have any official place in what the humanitarians call the humanitarian ecosystem. So for the heritage sector, working with the humanitarian sector is very new. And Blue Shield only signed our MOU with the ICRC in 2002, just before lockdown following COVID. And the image there is of people from the Red Cross, so from the legal service of Red Cross, humanitarian service, and the Director General, Yves Dacour, and myself, then President Carl Habsburg, and a colleague who has helped with the preparation of this through numerous conversations and working with the humanitarian sector, Jennifer Price-Jones. So it's very new, and we haven't really been able to follow up because of COVID-19 and lack of capacity. So that humanitarian, as they call it, ecosystem includes a very wide and diverse range of stakeholders, including the United Nations and many of its agencies, national governments, international and national non-governmental organizations, and a very wide range and variety of donors, frequently focusing on specific groups at risk: women, children, minorities. And all of those have different motivations or starting points, but all looking to provide life-saving assistance to alleviate suffering and maintain human dignity to those in need. And I picked that from a humanitarian website. And to me, that equals what I have been using as the term healthy, peaceful, secure, sustainable communities. So again, as the triangle within the circle that we've talked about in terms of what Blue Shield is about, with different points of that triangle having different starting points, although looking for that end result of healthy, peaceful, secure, sustainable communities, so do many of the stakeholders in the humanitarian ecosystem start from different starting points, but to have that similar end aim. So numerous organizations decide and outline their humanitarian principles, and I have chosen to use The definition is provided by the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, or OCHA, in a 2012 publication. And OCHA claimed that there are 4 humanitarian principles. Firstly, humanity. Human suffering must be addressed wherever it is found. The purpose of humanitarian action is to protect life and health and ensure respect for human beings. Secondly, impartiality. Humanitarian actors must not take sides in hostilities or engage in controversies of a political, racial, religious, or ideological nature. And then third, neutrality. Humanitarian action must be carried out on the basis of need alone, giving priority to the most urgent cases of distress and making no distinctions on the basis of nationality, race, gender, religious belief, class, or political opinions. And finally, 4, independence. Humanitarian action must be autonomous from the political, economic, military, or other objectives that any actor may hold with regard to areas where humanitarian action is being implemented. So those OCHA humanitarian principles, you can see, are not very different to some of the principles for the Blue Shield as identified in the Strasbourg Charter. The humanitarian system or ecosystem have divided themselves up into what they call the cluster system. And that cluster system works in a almost circular way through prevention, mitigation, preparedness, disaster, response, recovery, reconstruction, in a way not dissimilar to our 4-tier approach. And here you have in this inner circle the UN agencies, so UNICEF, High Commission for Refugees, World Health Organization, the World Food Programme, etc., all working towards that goal. And again, this image provided by OCHA. The problem with that system, that cluster system, is that there is a missing UN partner. UNESCO, the UN Cultural Agency, has no official place in the cluster system and has no formal humanitarian ecosystem presence at all. So we are simply not there. Focusing in a little bit on the International Red Cross Crescent movement. The International Red Cross Crescent movement is a global humanitarian network of, and I'm always astonished at this figure, 80 million people that helps those facing disaster, conflict, and health and social problems. Most of those 80 million volunteers at national level, but nonetheless a staggering number. It consists of, so the Red Cross Red Crescent movement consists of 3 elements: the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, the International Federation of Red Cross Crescent Societies, the IFRC, and at the moment, the 192 National Red Cross Crescent Societies. And very simply, the ICRC deals with armed conflict, the Federation deals with disasters and other emergencies, and national societies support these international activities and work independently in their own countries. But of course, there is overlap between those 3 areas. The Red Cross Red Crescent's movement's fundamental principles, so slightly different to OCHA's one. They have 7, not 4. But of course, the 7 drill down into OCHA's 4 in a little bit more detail. So humanity, impartiality, neutrality, independence, voluntary service, unity, and universality. And those again echo the Strasbourg Charter for the Blue Shield. And these 7 principles provide the ethical, operational, institutional framework to the work of the Red Cross Crescent movement. And there you see in the image the ICRC headquarters in Geneva. And when we were in these rooms signing the MOU, we were joking with Yves Dacour, the Director General, that if he gave up his car park next to this, we could build a similar building for the Blue Shield, an aspiration that we'll get to at some point. Another critical part of the whole humanitarian ecosystem is something called the Sphere movement. And this was started in 1997 by a group of humanitarian professionals, including the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, aiming to improve the quality of humanitarian work during disaster response. And this stemmed from people's frustration that there were no standards in place and no normal understanding of what a humanitarian response should be and how it could be measured in quality. So the movement framed a humanitarian charter and identified a set of humanitarian standards to be applied in all humanitarian responses. And the Sphere handbook in which these documents are held, the charter, the minimum standards, is one of the most widely known and internationally recognized sets of common principles and universal minimum standards in humanitarian response. The humanitarian charter contained within that handbook stresses the rights to protection and assistance reflected in the provisions of international humanitarian law, human rights law, and refugee law. And there are three key rights: the right to life with dignity, the right to receive humanitarian assistance, and the right to protection and security. It stresses, the Charter stresses the general immunity of the civilian population from attack and reprisals during armed conflict, and in particular, the importance of three things. Firstly, the principle of distinction between civilians and combatants, and between civilian objects and military objectives. Secondly, the principles of proportionality in the use of force and of precaution in attack. And then two further elements: the duty to refrain from the use of weapons that are indiscriminate or that by their nature cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering, and the duty to permit impartial relief to be provided. So that's the Charter. That's what we're hoping, or that's what the humanitarian ecosystem aspires to deliver. The handbook comprises the humanitarian charter, the protection principles, the core standards, and minimum humanitarian standards in four vital areas of response. So the first half of it is those general parts, and then there are four specific chapters on water supply, sanitation and hygiene promotion, food security and nutrition, shelter and settlement, and health. And so, as just one example, the standards will have the normal number of, for example, tents per X number of people, or toilets per X number of people, and how they should be provided. Critically, the handbook is used by UN agencies, national and international NGOs, and governmental authorities globally when planning, delivering, and evaluating humanitarian operations. So it is the go-to document, and you can have a glance at it online if you go to the Sphere website. So take that back to the Blue Shield diagram, and here we are in the center of the diagram, the Blue Shield, and here's the humanitarian sector as just described, at obviously a very top level, but showing where they're coming from and how we hope they may deliver and engage in this conversation. And we saw that in the 1950s, there was an aspiration to get involved with at least the cultural heritage sector. But we also saw how that had slipped away by 2003. I think things are getting better. And if we move on, if we look at one of the UN agencies, the World Health Organization's definition of health, and it's a state of complete physical, but critically mental and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And the definition notes that the health of all peoples is fundamental to the attainment of peace and security, and is dependent on the fullest cooperation of individuals and states. So there's a clear leaning towards understanding the broader health of people. And as we would argue, part of that health and that well-being is tied up with access to their cultural property. And the right to life with dignity. Crisis-affected people have more than physical well-being, dignity demands, respect for the whole person, including the values and beliefs of individuals and affected communities. And that comes directly from the Sphere Handbook, the 2018 edition. So again, it's there and being identified, and there's a fantastic postage stamp that's on the image, even wars have limits. And there's a armed combatant talking to a young girl, 50 years of the Geneva Conventions. So there is a growing awareness as it develops. And that was perhaps encapsulated, if we go back to the image of the signing of the MOU in February of 2020, where Yves Dacour, then the Director General of the ICRC, was quoted as saying, "Protecting cultural property and cultural heritage against the devastating effects of war, unfortunately, remains a humanitarian imperative today, perhaps more than ever." So Yves there saying that absolutely as it's in the diagram, bottom left point of the triangle of Blue Shield, is willing, should be able, and is becoming increasingly keen to engage in that discussion there. And you can see the Red Cross flying from the tower in Dubrovnik there, while shelling is going on of the World Heritage Site in the late 1990s. So Blue Shield's initial aspirations in terms of working with the humanitarian sector, and we don't try and say that we're going to change the whole world tomorrow. This is going to be a slow process. But in particular, in the first instance with the ICRC and the wider Red Cross Crescent movement, firstly, we want to do workshops with the ICRC legal teams to engage with them and understand how we both come to the legal responsibilities of those involved in armed conflict. We want to work with a group within the IC that is called their Armed and Security Forces Delegates. And this is a unit of about 80, mainly ex-military and police and customs colleagues who work with the ICRC in their relations with those armed and security forces. And what we want to do, and we've already started these conversations with both groups, is to start off with workshops, but then perhaps with the Armed Force and Security Forces group, actually provide them some initial training on the value of CPP to the humanitarian sector. And that's something that we hope we will be able to follow up early in 2022. And then thirdly, which again was also under discussion, and we had meetings when we were in Geneva in February of last year, the idea of an exhibition on cultural property protection at the Red Cross Museum in Geneva, because that Red Cross Museum, of course, doesn't only attract members of the Red Cross, but members of the whole UN community and all of the humanitarian organizations that are based in Geneva, and of course the general public in Geneva. So we hope that that exhibition again will be resurrected as an idea, and that we'll be able to work on that from 2022. And then probably the biggest aspiration is to have both cultural property protection and the Blue Shield mentioned in the next issue of the Sphere Handbook. And we think we've got about 5 years until that handbook is fully updated again. So we're not going to get our own chapter yet on CPP. That's a longer term aspiration, but it's there in my mind, certainly. But what I think we can do is get CPP and the Blue Shield mentioned in the first half of the Sphere Handbook. And that, I think, is a legitimate and realistic and achievable aim within the next 5 years. It's not going to be an easy one, because the Sphere process is it must be driven bottom up. So those who work for Sphere as the organization, a very small team, can't say to all its members, we want to include CPP. The members have to say, Sphere, listen to us, we think CPP should be included. And one of the ways of doing that is the exhibition at the Red Cross Museum and the building of closer links with the ICRC. And that's the plan. Thank you very much for listening, and please don't hesitate to jot down questions for the sessions at the end of this block 1. Thank you.